When I was 17 years old in 2005, I lived in a quiet village where nothing ever happened. At least, that is what we thought. I had just gotten my license and was excited to meet up with my older boyfriend in the city over the weekend. It was the first time I could drive my car alone since getting my license, so it was a celebration of sorts. Living in Wisconsin, the distance between the village and the city was not too far, 40 miles to Milwaukee, with the highway connecting major cities conveniently nearby. Shortly after leaving the village, I noticed a white car on the side of the road. While not unusual in the winter when people might need help, it was odd to see in the summer. I noticed an 80-year-old boy walking away from the car. We were about a mile away from civilization, and the nearest city was 14 miles away. Despite it not being the winter season, I decided to stop and see if I could help. I assumed he might be with a grandparent who couldn't walk that far back to town for help. It was a time when having a cell phone wasn't common, especially among young people and the elderly in 2005. I pulled over next to the boy and asked him what was going on. He explained that he was on his way to the only car repair shop in town, which was at least 3 miles away from our location. I expressed that it was a long way to walk and offered him a ride. He seemed hesitant, so I told him I was a student at the high school a mile away. I assured him he could hold my cell phone and my ID until we got there, and if he ever felt afraid, he could easily dial 911 without me being able to stop him. Moreover, the distance to his destination was just a 3-minute drive. Initially, I suggested we speak to the person in the car first, but the boy seemed to panic, which raised a red flag. Nonetheless, he insisted that we should just go. Despite being just a kid myself, I allowed him to see my ID, which displayed my local address, and he eventually got into my car. He seemed at ease while holding my phone and ID. At that time, it wasn't possible to dial 911 without a passcode, so I gave him my passcode, and he seemed comfortable being able to access my phone. I jokingly told him not to check my boyfriend's messages, as he was too young for such things. Considering the times and the neighborhood, it seemed reasonable to be cautious. However, unexpectedly, the car that appeared to be broken down suddenly screeched to life and chased after us, with its blinker on, insisting that I pull over. I looked at the young boy in my passenger seat with raised eyebrows. It was odd that this child, around 8 years old, was showing visible fear. The man from the car pulled over behind me, got out, and angrily slammed his car door as he walked up to my window. This behavior struck me as strange since they were supposed to be broken down, and the boy seemed extremely afraid. To hear the man, I rolled down my window slightly, but I was frightened as I hadn't expected a broken down car to chase after me. I found it hard to believe what he was saying, that he was a social worker and the child I had picked up was dangerous to himself and others, putting me at risk. He claimed the child could have killed me. The situation was alarming, and I turned to the boy for clarity after rolling up the window to the man's face. I asked if he knew the man and if what he was saying was true. Fear was evident in my eyes, but I think the boy misunderstood. I wasn't afraid of him, but of the man outside my window. The boy replied with a no, perhaps trying to protect me as well. The entire situation felt unsettling and off, especially considering the man's aggressive behavior. I was afraid he might have attacked me if I had rolled down the window further. Despite my concerns, the boy reassured me that he would be okay and chose to go with the man. The look of dread on the boy's face still haunts my dreams to this day. Feeling uneasy about the situation, I was troubled as the boy got into the man's car and they drove away towards the city. I immediately called my date, informing him I would be very late, and rushed to the school with the man's license plate in mind. Once at the school, I frantically shared the incident with the liaison officer, screaming his name like a banshee. I told him about the child, and he informed me that someone had dialed 911 about my stopping to pick up the boy. Luckily, the authorities apprehended the man and the boy just as I reached the school. The caller had also been suspicious of me, which scared my liaison officer. Despite being the school's biggest goody two-shoes, even though I was the only goth, I was advised never to stop for a child again to avoid any suspicion of abduction. The officer acknowledged my bravery for intervening but cautioned me about the potential risks involved. In the end, the man in the car went to jail, and the boy was safely brought back home. Although I never learned all the details of the case, I knew that day I had prevented some unknown abuse from happening. Despite the risks and uncertainties, I am grateful that I stopped to help that boy. So, I live in a city in northeastern India. However, my parents and I always visit our grandma's house in the countryside during holidays and special occasions. The small town, or kind of a village, where my grandma's house is located is surrounded by farmland, houses, and small woods. Let me get to the scary part now. The town, like any other ordinary town in our state, has witnessed some weird incidents over the years. I'll share the ones I can remember. The oldest story was told by my dad when I was a kid. He said that he and his friends, along with some of my uncles, were hanging out in the cabin at the back of my grandma's house in the backyard. The backyard is connected to a small pond and a few square kilometers of woods and farmland, as my mother's side of the family owns various parts of the property. They were having a good time when suddenly they spotted a fireball passing through the bamboo trees in the backyard. The fireball appeared to be detached from any stick or lamp, and they didn't hear any footsteps or see anyone around. An odd detail was that they described the fireball as blue, and somewhere I read that blue fireballs are associated with spirits and paranormal stuff. On another occasion, I can't recall the whole incident clearly, but my aunt was cooking in the kitchen when she heard a whistle coming from the backyard through the kitchen window. Sometime later, my dad and one of my uncles went outside to dispose of the trash from the previous day. They saw a man using our abandoned toilet in the backyard, which my grandpa had built for the less fortunate people in the area. My uncle sensed potential danger and thought the guy might be a robber or something, so he and my father quickly went back into the house to get some tools, phone, torches, and a safety knife. However, when they returned, the guy had vanished, even though it had only been a minute. My aunt in the kitchen had been keeping an eye on the guy, so it was strange how he disappeared so quickly. It's unclear if it was paranormal or an attempted robbery. There are other events as well. One of my uncles had partied late at night and was returning home when he felt something following him. The road was dark and slightly foggy, and no one else was around, which added to the eerie feeling. He got scared and began walking faster, shining his phone flashlight behind him. He heard the footsteps creeping him out and decided to play God's prayer or psalm on his phone while walking faster. Unfortunately, his phone suddenly died, and the footsteps continued to chase him. He sprinted through our backyard, using it as a shortcut since it's connected to the road and farmlands. When he reached home, he told his mother, my grandma, that he was chased by a single footstep. He couldn't see anyone. The next morning, he shared the full story, and most of my family dismissed it as a mild paranormal incident. As I mentioned earlier, this town has its fair share of strange happenings, and it's become somewhat normal for us to encounter them. In 2019, the community organized an event where they sang God's prayers to ward off evil spirits, as a lot of suicides were happening at that time, and some people believed that evil spirits were the cause. For me, I consider myself a skeptic, but I'm also somewhat open to the idea of the paranormal. After living in this town, you'd expect me to be a firm believer, but my mind struggles to fully comprehend these occurrences. I'm a female living in Colorado. I'm 18 now, but this story happened when I was 14 and leading up to last year. I have been living with my grandfather a few towns over from the rest of my family since the summer of my freshman year of high school for school. My first summer here started well, working with my grandpa and not making a lot of money, but being happy with my own space and room with a big bed. It was a refreshing change after spending the last 13 or so years in a house full of 5 people. I thought it would be nice to be in a smaller town where I didn't really know anyone and could make new friends. My grandpa invited me to go to a town dinner with him one evening, and since I didn't have anything better to do, I went with him. However, I felt uncomfortable in the room full of people I didn't know, so after finishing my meal, I went outside to sit on the swing at the park. After sitting there for about 10 minutes, I heard some rocks moving behind me. I turned to see a man walking around the swings. He was in his early 20s, wearing a nice dress shirt, but it was wrinkled and stained, and his pants were the same. When he noticed I saw him, he said hey in a very calm voice. Being raised to be polite and not ignore people, I talked to him for a few minutes until the dinner was over, and my grandpa drove around the park to pick me up. Little did I know that talking to him that night was a big mistake. Once I started school in that town, my grandpa was short on help and decided to hire that man to work with him. My grandpa described him as not very bright, doing dangerous things at work without realizing it. Every time I ran into him in town, I would pretend not to see him and hurry away to hide until he left. A few weeks later, my grandpa fired him and gave him his last paycheck. Later that week, the man showed up at our house asking to get his job back, but my grandpa refused, saying he already had new help. The man then asked if I was home, but my grandpa ignored his question and shut the door. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. Over the next few months, my grandpa hired new people who knew that man. One day after school, my grandpa told me to avoid that man every time I saw him. I asked why he was suddenly concerned again, and what he told me made me sick to my stomach. The man had told others that he was in love with a 14-year-old and planned to marry her, referring to me as her. They instantly knew he meant me and informed my grandpa of what he had said. My grandpa was furious. The following year, I was outside smoking, enjoying the night air and looking at the stars when I suddenly saw him right in front of my porch. I threw my cigarette and ran inside, locking the door behind me and yelling for my grandpa, telling him that the man had just been in the yard walking up to me. My grandpa grabbed his gun and went outside, but he couldn't find him. The next day, my grandpa went to that man's grandmother's house to tell her that her grandson was trespassing and he wouldn't hesitate to shoot him if he ever scared me again. For a few years, I didn't hear anything about him, and I thought I was done dealing with him. However, this last year, shortly after my 18th birthday, I received a Facebook message request from a random account with a name I didn't know. I opened the message, and it contained disgusting messages, pictures, and a video. The username used to create the account was his. I freaked out, started crying, and called my oldest sister. She told me to screenshot the messages and send them to our mother as evidence of harassment so she could go to the police. I did as advised, and now I'm just hoping it's over for good.